I want to say this to you again. I said this to you a couple of weeks ago, but I just want to remind you of this, that to master anything, you first have to master the fundamentals. There is no becoming great at a thing without mastering the fundamentals of that particular thing. You just can't do it. This applies to every single thing you want to become great at. So a few weeks ago, we just used the illustration of basketball. There is no becoming great at basketball apart from mastering the fundamentals of basketball. And that applies to everything that you'd want to get good at. There is no such thing as being a great mathematician if you don't first master the fundamentals of addition and subtraction. It's really hard to be a great author if you don't know your ABCs, right? It's just the fundamentals are that important. To master anything, you first must master the fundamentals of that thing. And that is also true of the Christian life. There's no great Christian who first didn't learn the basics, like the fundamentals of what it means to follow Jesus. So this is really what we've given the month of January to, is we just wanted to revisit some of the basics with you, some of those core fundamentals that it just sort of has to be in play if we are going to faithfully follow Jesus. So a couple of weeks ago, we covered one of those fundamentals. Here is one fundamental of following. Followers of Jesus delight daily in Jesus. This is just part of what it means to follow Jesus with faithfulness. We have a regular rhythm in our life of opening up the Bible and taking it in. You remember the hand, how we grab the Bible, we hear the Word, we read the Word, we study the Word, we memorize the Word, and the thumb is we meditate on the Word, we think about what is in the Bible. It's just a regular rhythm of delighting daily in Jesus through the Word. It's one of those fundamentals. Ryan did just such a good job last week of covering a fundamental. Last week, Ryan talked about how followers of Jesus do life with others. That Christianity is a team sport. If we're not doing it with others, we are not going to consistently and faithfully follow Jesus over the long haul. It's going to be an impossibility for us. We do life with others. This is just one of those core fundamentals. It is a team sport. This is why God has given you a church family, so you could be known by people, so you could know other people. This is one of the core ways, core fundamentals that Jesus has given us if we are going to faithfully follow him. And now today, we're going to cover our last fundamental, our last basic. Following Jesus, here's what it requires. Following Jesus means that we do life not just with others last week, but we do life for others. That we do life for others. That's where we're headed today. Now to see that, I want you to go to Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10. Now let me just kind of get you acclimated to the context of Mark chapter 10. For 2 chapters, now really 3 chapters, from chapter 8 through verses 10, here is what Jesus is doing. Jesus is discipling the disciples. Right, that's what he's doing. He's teaching them. He's got things he wants them to know, and he's letting them know some of those things. This is the context of these 3 chapters, Mark 8, 9, and 10. And then you get to chapter 10, verse 35, and Jesus is about to lay down a crucial lesson. This is one of those vital lessons. It's one of those fundamentals. He's got something he wants them to see. If they're going to faithfully follow Jesus, they've got to get this thing right here down. Jesus is teaching them in this text how to become great. He is showing them the path to greatness, how to be great. He shows them how God thinks about, how God sees greatness. This is the lesson that he's got for them in this text. Now, Jesus is going to teach them this lesson by first exposing their desire for greatness, then redirecting that desire for greatness, and then he's going to show them what they need to become great. That's where Jesus is about to take them. So let's just take it in those parts. First, Jesus exposes our desire for greatness. So starting in verse 32, if you look back right before the passage you just heard read, Jesus and his disciples, they're on the way to Jerusalem. And this is the 3rd time in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is going to tell them what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem. Right? He's just let them know. He says, I'm going to be delivered over to the chief priests and to the scribes. Jesus is saying, when we get to Jerusalem, it's going to go really bad for me. I'm going to be falsely accused. I'm going to be humiliated. I'm going to be mocked. I'm going to be spit upon. I'm going to be condemned, and then I'm going to be cut down in Jerusalem. That's what's coming for me. You could think about it this way. Jesus, in that text there, 32 through 34, is exposing his soul to his closest friends. It's a very vulnerable, honest moment that Jesus is giving them. He's exposing the deepest places of his heart. Now, notice what comes next, verse 35. So he's just exposed his soul. And then verse 35, and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. They just became 5 years old again, didn't they? I mean, that is such a ridiculous way of approaching Jesus. Jesus, you know the game. Your job is to say yes, and it doesn't matter what we ask. Right? This is what has just happened. Verse 36. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. And Jesus said to them, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink. With the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those whom it has been prepared. And when the 10, so now we're to the other disciples, the 10 others, when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. So just think about what's happened here. Jesus has just exposed his soul to his closest friends. He has just told them, we're going to Jerusalem, I'm about to die. And then James and John are like, did you say die? We've got something else we want to talk about. They've just moved right past his humiliation, right to their own personal exaltation. Jesus, we don't really care about your humiliation. We've got something about our exaltation that we want you to do. Right? This is what's happening here. They look at Jesus and they say, hey, when you set up your kingdom, here's the request. Will you let us, James and John, I mean, we're talking about your boys here, Jesus. Will you let James and John, your boys, will you let them sit at your right hand and at your left hand? Would you give us the great seats in your kingdom? God, Jesus, would you do that for us? Now, when you think about this desire for greatness that is being exposed in this passage, this is not like a one-time moment for them. This desire for greatness is a consistent theme in their life, in the disciples' life. And, you know, what's amazing is this is the second time in 2 chapters that this has happened. The second time in 2 chapters that this very conversation is going on. So if you back up to Mark chapter 9, in verse 30, for the second time, Jesus looks at his disciples and says, hey, I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die there. It's the second time he said it in Mark 9. And then in Mark 9, the same thing happens. In verse 33, he's just exposed his heart to all of his disciples. And then in verse 33, it says, and they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, Jesus asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued. This is all 12 of the disciples. They have argued about with one another about who was the greatest. So this whole greatness conversation. It's not a one-time conversation in their life. This is a consistent conversation in their life. James and John weren't the only ones concerned about greatness. They were all 12 of the disciples were concerned about greatness. So in chapter 10, verse 41, the rumor mill sort of makes its way back to the disciples. They hear what James and John have asked, and the text says they were all indignant at James and John. They were upset at James and John. Now, that's a big word to describe big emotion, indignant. They were furious at James and John. Now, the question becomes, why were they indignant? And I think the text is trying to answer it by saying, here's why, because they all wanted the greatest seat. That they all wanted on the right hand and the left hand. They were all concerned about who was the highest. Now, just think about this. This is the disciples. This is the 12 guys who Jesus picked to come and follow him and to start the church and to do the stuff. And they are just a mess, aren't they? It is just a mess in this text. But this is Jesus exposing their deep desire for greatness, for honor, for applause, for glory, for greatness. This is what he's exposing. This is what he's showing in them. Now, imagine if you were Jesus, what would you do with these disciples? I mean, they're a mess here, right? Everybody's trying to figure out who's the greatest. How can I become the greatest? How can I get the right hand in the left hand seat? How can I do all? What would you do if you were Jesus? Imagine that you don't know what's going to happen next in the story. How would you respond? How would you expect Jesus to respond? Well, this is what we see in verse 42. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them." Verse 43, "But it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you." Now, let me just pause there, and I want you to notice something here. Jesus doesn't renounce their desire for greatness. I just want you to notice that. He doesn't look at them and say, "How shameful it is of you to desire greatness." He doesn't do that. He does not renounce their desire for greatness. Why? Because that desire for greatness was put there by God, for God. That desire for greatness that lives in you and in them was put there by God and for God. It's part of what it means to be made in the image of God. This goes all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2. God put our first parents in a garden, and he put this in them, that desire for greatness. He put in Adam and Eve that desire for greatness, and in you that desire for greatness. And Adam and Eve, our first parents, and you and I were meant to look up to God to see how to fulfill that desire for greatness. What to do with that desire for greatness, how greatness would actually be achieved in our life. So God put it there for us then to look at him for the fulfillment of that desire for greatness. But then in Genesis 3, our first parents sinned against God, and sin twisted and distorted everything, including that desire for greatness. So now, rather than taking that deep down desire for greatness and doing what God says do with it, we do what the world says do with it. That desire for greatness has just been distorted and twisted in us. It is now a desire that has gone the world's way, not God's way. And Jesus is looking at them and saying, no, I don't want you to take that desire for greatness and run the wrong direction with it. I don't want you to do that with it. I want you to come toward me with that desire for greatness. So again, I just want you to notice he does not renounce their desire for greatness. He looks at them and says, but whoever would be great among you. Like, if you want to be great, let me show you the way. He does not renounce their desire for greatness. Jesus redirects it. Jesus takes that desire for greatness that he put in you, and now he's going to redirect it to the very thing that would lead to greatness. He redirects their desire for greatness. Jesus says, if you want to be great, let me show you how to do that. Verse 43. But it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must. That's an exclusive word, right? It's like there's no workarounds. There's no other options here. If you want to be great, you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be a slave of all. Now, again, he's discipling his disciples, and he is showing them what greatness is and the path toward greatness. And he's showing them that greatness isn't defined by how much money you have, how much power you have, how much prestige that you accumulate. Greatness doesn't equate into your ability to kind of claw your way to the top and to see how many people you can put beneath you. Jesus is saying that is not how God sees greatness. Rather, Jesus says, to be great, you must be a servant. Isn't that a strange thing for Jesus to say? An upside down thing for Jesus to say. If you want to be great, here is the path toward greatness. You've got to be a servant. If you want to be great, you have to get low. You have to get so low that you can serve other people. That is the path to greatness. He says, if you want to be great, you must be a slave. I mean, could Jesus say anything more offensive? Anything more counterintuitive than, okay, here is the path to greatness, slavery. You have to be a slave. That's your path to greatness. Jesus is saying to be great, you have to lose the rights to your life. There's no other way to greatness, he's saying. If you want to be great, this is the way. It's the way of being a slave. You have to lose the right to your life. You have to give your life away in radical acts of service and sacrifice. This is the way to greatness. To be great, Jesus adds these two little words. He says, if you want to be great, you have to be a servant. You have to be a slave. And here's the two words. Of all. Of all. Not just of some, but of all. Not just of the deserving, of those who serve you, so you get to serve them in return. Love you, so now you get to love them in return. They do things for you, so now it almost even pays you to serve them. He's saying, no, it's not just those who deserve it. It's not just those who love you that you're going to be a servant of, a slave of. No, it's a servant of all. Of those who give you nothing in return, of those who it is costly to serve, of those who it is inconvenient to serve. That is the pathway to greatness. Jesus says, if you want to see greatness in God's eyes, here it is, a servant of all, a slave of all. I love this text because Jesus is looking at his disciples and he's saying to them, you want to be great. I want you to be great, and I'm just trying to show you the path of greatness. And Jesus is saying the path of greatness runs through the valley of the cross. It takes you getting low to become great. So the question for us when we read this text is, do you believe that? I mean, this is one of those things where when I read this, I have to take a step back and I have to ask that question. Do I really believe that's true? Because there is nothing else in this world saying that. Do I believe that is true, that this really is the pathway to greatness? Because there have always been competing sort of perceptions of what it means to be great. You see it here in verse 42, even in the first century. But there's always been these competing perceptions of greatness. In verse 42, here's the sort of running thought of the day of what greatness would look like. Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, okay, now he's about to define what worldly greatness looks like. He says, you know that those who are considered rulers, those who are considered great of the Gentiles, here's what they do. They lord their greatness over them. And their great ones exercise authority over them. So this is the view of greatness. This is how the world sees greatness. Greatness is defined by those at the top, not those at the bottom. It's defined by those who exercise their rights and authorities, not by those who give away their rights and authority. See, he's just showing them that there are two ways that people see greatness. There is the world's way over here, and there is God's way over there. And here is how the world sees greatness. It sees greatness as the ability to make servants of all. So let me look at the world, and let me make servants of everyone that I see. That is how the world sees greatness. Greatness is getting others below you. Which is why Webster's dictionary defines greatness this way: to be chief or preeminent over others. Right? This is how our world sees greatness. You're great in athletics if you're better than everyone else. Right? You're great in school if you get more A's than everybody else. You're great in just fill in the blank. If you are better at that thing than every single other person. Right? If you've climbed to the top of that thing, then you're great. But that is not how Jesus sees greatness. Greatness, God's way, looks like this: not to make servants of all for our sake, but to be a servant of all for Jesus' sake. This is how God sees greatness: to be a servant of all for Jesus' sake. Now again, we just need to ask the question. We should not assume that this is how we see greatness. We should ask. We should investigate that. Is this the way that I see greatness? Do I see greatness like Jesus sees greatness? Even think about the last 4, 5, 6 times you've used the word great. Is it in a worldly way of seeing greatness sort of a way, or is it in a Jesus-like way of seeing greatness? Is it used to describe those who have climbed their way to the top, or those who have willingly subjected themselves, willingly gotten really, really low in their life? How do you use the word great? We should ask ourselves, do we see greatness like Jesus does? And then we should ask ourselves, does this describe us? Are we low in our life? Or are we high? Have we become servants of all, slaves of all? Or are we trying to make servants of all? Just take a look at your life and ask some of those type of questions. That would be a great question to work out in your group this week. Is this describing the who that I am becoming? And one of the best ways to know if you are a servant of all is by watching how you respond to the people who treat you like a servant. Think of the last person who treated you like a servant. I mean, they're just sort of stripping some dignity from you. They're rude, they're uncaring, they're not showing you respect, they lie to you. They have nothing to offer you. Just think of the last person who treated you like a servant. Now ask yourself the question, how did you then treat them? That is showing you how low you have gotten. It's showing you if you become a servant of some or a servant of all. Most of us live with an unconscious pursuit of worldly greatness. And those moments when we don't get it, when we don't get that worldly greatness, when we're treated not like everyone else is our servant, but when we have become a servant of someone else, we're treated like a slave, like a servant. In those moments where we don't get our quest for worldly greatness, it's showing us just how much we're living for it. It's exposing that in us. So what happens when you're treated like a servant? By your spouse. They didn't treat you the way you wanted them to treat you. What happens in that moment? Maybe it's by your coworker. Maybe it's by your son, your daughter, your parent. What happens in that moment where you're not treated the way that you want? What happens when that friend doesn't treat you the way that you want? I so want our church to become great, don't you? I so want that for you, for us, for the people of Stonegate. And becoming great has nothing to do with size, nothing to do with notoriety, nothing to do with the programs that we have here, the preaching, the music. It has nothing to do with those things. A great church is made up of men and women who are walking this painful path to greatness. That path that runs right through the valley of the cross, that path of becoming a servant of all. That's how a church becomes great in God's eyes. And I so want that for us. Greatness, that we would move in that direction, that we would step into what God calls great. Now, I want to take a quick sort of side note here, and I want to just think with you about it the other time this text or this story shows up in the Bible. There's another moment where this story shows up, same story, and it's in Matthew chapter 20. But there is one important difference in this story, and here is the difference. The difference is in who makes the request of Jesus. So in our text in Mark chapter 10, it is James and John who make the request. Jesus, I want to sit at your right hand and your left hand. But in Matthew, it's not James and John. Do you know who it is? Their mom. Their mom makes the request of Jesus. She comes to Jesus, she kneels, and she asks, can these two sons of mine sit at your right hand and your left hand? Their mom does it, right? Now, what is the insight of that? What should we take when we read the same account of this story in Matthew chapter 20? What's the insight there? Well, Matthew 20 makes us aware that every parent has ambitions for their kids, but not all of those ambitions align with Jesus. To every parent in the room, you have ambitions for your kids. And Matthew chapter 20 is in the Bible for one of the reasons is so that you could then test what your ambitions are. Do they align with God's ambitions or not? Do they have worldly greatness in mind, or do they have greatness as God would see it in mind? It's in the Bible for us to stop and think about that. For us to stop and ask, what are my ambitions for my kids? Parent, what is your ambition for your kids? If our greatest ambitions for our kids are for them to be great in the eyes of the world, right, for them to be bigger, better than anyone and everyone else, then we have missed what we're kind of our job as a parent, what we're designed to be as parents in their life. As a parent, our job is to prepare our kids to meet Jesus one day. So one of the responsibilities we have as parents is to pass along a biblical view of greatness, to help them see what greatness is. It's to make sure our greatest ambitions for our kids are that they would become humble people. People willing to get low so that when God sees them, He is seeing greatness in them. That is one of our responsibilities as a parent. So parents, let me just give you a couple of practical kind of helps here as we're trying to do this for our kids, to help them see greatness the way that God does. Number one, teach your kids God's definition of greatness. Every parent, we should just take this upon ourselves to make sure we're doing this, to teach our kids what God says is great, because the world is going to teach them its way. They are being discipled every day in terms of how the world sees greatness. So you get a chance to teach them how God sees greatness. That greatness has nothing to do with how well they throw a ball, they shoot it, they kick it, they whatever it. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with the score on a test, but greatness has everything to do with them learning how to sacrificially give their life away in acts of service. Just laying down their life for people, getting below people and becoming a servant of all. That's greatness, and you should see if your kids know that. You should ask them that. Who is great? What does it mean to be great? Who's the greatest person you know and why? Who do you most admire in life and why? You should ask them those questions, and then you should listen so that you can see how they see what greatness is. You can see if they have a biblical understanding of that word greatness, if they're seeing it like God does. So parents, we should make sure that our kids know the difference between what the world says is great and what God says is great. So we should teach our kids about biblical greatness. We should also teach our kids to admire greatness, to admire it. Now, greatness in the scriptures is primarily seen in the person of Jesus, right? He is your great example of what it means to be great. But we don't just see greatness in the scriptures. We also see it in our everyday life. Greatness is all around us and the people around us. It's everywhere around us, especially if you're in a church family. Let me just show you what I mean. This morning, we had a bunch of guys show up and gals show up. They're out there in the cold this morning to make sure you are welcomed when you come into the parking lot. And it feels like 20 degrees outside. And they're out there serving you. Last week, we had 600 kids in our kids ministry. And we have hundreds of adults over there evangelizing our kids, teaching them the ways of God. When you walk through our kids ministry, you are seeing biblical greatness before you. That's what you're seeing over there. In our student ministry, we have dozens and dozens of adults who are pouring their life into our students around Stonegate. When I walk in here and I see our adults up here on a Wednesday night doing the thing that is happening up here, I so often wonder, like, okay, let's just fast forward 20 years. And I wonder what this investment is going to make in that kid's life. I wonder how God sees this moment, because it is biblical greatness. And we could just go on around the ministries and the people around our church. You're just seeing it everywhere. And we should teach our kids to see that. That is biblical greatness. The world is never going to applaud someone for going over to kids ministry and serving over there. But God sure does. God sure looks at that and says, that right there is what I call greatness. You getting on the floor and figuring out how to serve a 3-year-old, that is biblical greatness. We should teach our kids to admire it. And then we should teach our kids greatness by example. The best way to teach anything is by modeling, by showing them what greatness looks like through our life. That's sort of our first obligation to our kids, is to model these things to them. So your kids need to see that this is a reality in your life, that mom and dad are the sort of people who joyfully give their time and talents and treasure, just their life away for the glory of Jesus. They need to see that in you. They need to see that my mom and dad are the sort of people that when they see a need, they meet the need. When something needs to be done, my mom and dad are the sort of people who do the thing. Right? They need to see that model. So I just want to encourage you in this way. Become great in your home. Become great there. Your kids need to see that in your home. To the dads in the room. Dads, let me just plead with you for a moment. Greatness in the home is not a dad who has a bunch of servants, but who is a servant. That's what greatness looks like. You being a servant of everyone in your home. Mom, that's what greatness looks like. If you're one of, you're a kiddo still under the authority and in the house of your parents, this is what greatness looks like. It looks like you getting low enough to become a servant of those in your home. This is sort of the training ground for biblical greatness. It's right there in the home. And then the second training ground is in the church. Be great in your church home. And not just in your home, but in your church home. So I want to just take a moment to linger here. To those who are already serving at Stonegate right now, you're already kind of on that path toward biblical greatness. I just want to look at you and say thank you for that. I hope you feel affirmed as you're hearing these things today. You are becoming great in the eyes of God. You are doing the things that Jesus says is great. You are becoming a servant of all. So thank you for serving. I hope you feel affirmed and encouraged today. Now, for those who aren't serving, this is a Sunday that we hope God will use to point that desire for greatness that's in your heart. It's alive in you somewhere. To point that desire for greatness to the things that Jesus actually calls great. Namely, for you to stoop down, making yourself a servant of all. That this would be a Sunday where that happens. It's a Sunday that we want to encourage you towards serving, not just in a very broad, sort of general sense, but in a very particular one. Serving your church family. That's what the church is. It's a family. And it only works when the whole family is serving together. When the whole family is doing this, becoming great in the eyes of God, making themselves a servant for all. One of the reasons Jesus gives us a church is because the church provides a path for you to pursue what Jesus says is great. The church does that for you. This is one of the reasons Jesus gives us a church. So let's just take it at Stonegate. Here's what we do at Stonegate. We enjoy Jesus and we make disciples. And for us to do that, for us to accomplish that, it means that every single person at Stonegate has a role to play. And there are dozens of teams for you to jump onto and to play that role, for you to become a servant of all, for you to come into what the Bible says is biblical greatness. There is a seat for you there. So you should have gotten this on the seat when you walked in. Would you just go ahead and grab that? And this would be just, I want you to go ahead and start praying over this. If you open that up to the inside, you're going to see teams there. And there are 10 or 11 of these that you could jump onto just almost immediately and to begin to serve. And so if you are not serving somewhere right now, I would encourage you to be looking over this sheet and to ask the Lord, what would sort of align with who that you have made me to be, with some of my giftings and passions? What would sort of align there? And then I want to move toward this. Ask the Lord to show you what one or two of these could you move toward. And as soon as we finish the service today, all of these ministries are going to be out in the lobby and available for you. And what I want to encourage you to do when we finish the service is to take one or two of these teams, to go find them in the lobby, and then to make that connection. They'll follow up with you this week to kind of get the next steps going and how to connect you onto one of these teams. This is a way for you to pursue biblical greatness. So find one or two of these teams and meet them in the lobby as soon as we're finished today. Okay, now I want to finish here. Let's think about this text. Jesus is exposing their desire for greatness, then he redirects it. He said, I want you to be great too. Here is the way to become great. Become a servant of all. But then Jesus finishes by showing them what they need and what we need to actually become great. Okay, we need more than kind of a new definition or a new way of thinking about greatness. We need more than someone redirecting our desire for greatness. We need more than that. And this text is showing us what we need. Mark chapter 10, verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This would be a really simple, short verse to commit to memory for you. Mark 10:45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. If you want to become great for a few short years, then make servants of all. But if you want to become great for all eternity in the eyes of God, then become a servant of all. And Jesus really is the ultimate example of this, isn't he? He gave his life so that we could have life, right? He died so that we could live. He served us so that we could be saved. Jesus really is the great one. Like if you had to circle one great person, Jesus is the person that we would all circle. He is the great one, but we need more than a great example of greatness. We actually need the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus if we're ever going to walk in biblical greatness. It's why that word ransom is so important in that verse. That word ransom. That word is telling us two things. One, it shows us really our condition, the state that we're in, our problem. It's showing us our condition. Now, in 21st century America, that word ransom, it isn't an everyday word, right? It's just not a word that you probably use over the last week of your life. It's just not something we think about much. If you hear that word ransom or you think about it, it's probably because of a movie and a plot line where somebody gets kidnapped, right? This is our kind of view of ransom. But that wasn't true in the first century. It was everyday language then. Donald English, a commentator, he says it this way. Ransom was a familiar image in the Jewish, Roman, and Greek cultures. It was the price paid to liberate a slave, a prisoner of war, or a condemned person. So think about what that word ransom implies. It implies that we're a slave. It implies that we're a condemned person. It implies that we are locked in chains and we have no key to free ourselves. Right? That word ransom is reminding us that we are enslaved to our sin, that we are in a prison of our own selfishness and we have no way to get out of the prison, that we actually need the rescuing work of another. So it shows us our condition, that word ransom. But it also shows God's provision. Jesus said, here's why I've come, not to be served, but to serve and to give my life away as a ransom for many. This is Jesus saying, I came to be your servant. Right? I came to get lower than everyone. I came to be a servant of all, to give my life away for your ransom, to pay the very price of your liberation. I came to change your heart, to free you from that prison of selfishness, to make so that you can actually walk out of that prison and become a servant of all. I've come and I've lived and I died and I rose from the dead to do that very work. Friends, the perfect life of Jesus, through his death where he atoned for our sin, giving his life for ours, through that resurrection where he walked out of the grave, Jesus paid our ransom price. And when that settles deep in our bones, us becoming a servant of all becomes possible, even desirable in a Christian life. So let me just finish by an example. James and John are great examples of the difference that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus made. So let's take James. James went on to be a great leader in the early church. Kind of surprising after you read this text that James became that, right? In Mark chapter 10, he's a prideful man. He's marked by selfish ambition. But by the time you see him in Acts, he's a humble man. He's living to serve God and other people, all the way to the point that in Acts chapter 12, we read this. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Now, when I read that and I read Mark chapter 10, it makes me ask the question, what happened to James? What changed this man? How did he go from, give me the first seat, give me the applause and the admiration, to, I will give my life away to Jesus and other people? Answer: the Savior died as his ransom. How about John? This self-confident, prideful, I'm going to make everyone else my servant sort of a man. He later went on to write 5 books of the Bible. And in one of those books, 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, we read this from the hand of John. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. What happened to that man? How do you go from Mark chapter 10 to 1 John chapter 3? Answer: the Savior died as a ransom. Jesus lived, he died, he rose from the dead, and it changed them. It made them different people. It freed James and John then, and it can free you and I now. It can free us to lay down our agenda of making servants of all and to pick up Jesus' agenda of becoming a servant of all. And by God's grace, church, that's what I'm praying it would do for us. Amen? Why don't you bow with me? I want to give you just a moment to allow the Spirit of God to press into you what would be helpful and to wipe away the things that wouldn't be. Is this how you see greatness? Is this sort of greatness showing up in your life? Becoming a servant of all, not just some, but of all. The high maintenance people. The hard to love people, the inconvenient and costly, servants of all. Friend, this is the type of people God wants to make us. And I love that we're getting to finish this part of our service by taking communion, because really what communion is doing is helping us stare at Jesus giving his life as a ransom for many. It's allowing us to stare at the very thing that changes people from prideful, from self-absorbed, to getting low, becoming a servant of all. So you should have gotten communion elements when you came in. If you didn't, you can grab them in just a moment as we sing. And then this is going to be your chance to do some self-reflection, for you to prepare yourself to take communion. If you haven't taken Jesus, this is your chance to take Jesus. Throw your life upon him. Hold out your hands to him and say, God, would you save me? And he will. So take Jesus before you take communion. This is also your chance to ask that question: is this type of greatness showing up in my life? Can I see this type of greatness, becoming a servant of all? Is there any sin that you need to repent of? If so, as we sing, this is your chance to do that work. And then I'll come out in just a moment to lead us in communion. So Father, as we sing, would you come now and minister the good news of Jesus to us? It's in your good name that we ask it. Amen.